In 2015, there's going to be new Millennium Development Goals. What has been the process to set up to decide these, and how has that taken place?
Yes, so the current Millennium Development Framework will expire in 2015, and also there is a wide recognition that the world has changed and the new problems have arisen, such as how do we make sure that the growth is addressed together with the limitation that the planet has. How do we address climate change? How do we make sure that that some of the economic problems, such as a lack of jobs, is addressed? How do we make sure that goals between themselves are working in a more integrated way? So the whole process had been started to discuss what would be the new priorities, or how the current priorities would be addressed in a more efficient way. And I think in general there are two main players who should decide what should be the next framework. First of all, it's people, and secondly, it's governments. So current design of the discussion is trying to include people as much as possible, but representing civil society organization, I should say that at the moment we do have some concerns how poorest people, particularly most vulnerable ones, are included in the ongoing consultations. So the ongoing consultations are happening on the website, which is called The World We Want. It's the platform which gives space for discussions, firstly on different thematic topics. There are 11 consultations around health, inequality, growth, climate change, and each thematic consultation is happening in a different modality. Sometimes it's a web discussion, sometimes it's seminars, sometimes it's discussion papers. Also, there are consultations on country levels on different topics, so the governments really take the ownership for running those consultations. Also, regional consultations. However, again, I think it's important to think how poorest people are included in these consultations, and there are some initiatives like Participate, which really focus on the poorest people and make sure that their opinions are taken into consideration.
At the governmental level, it's the President of Indonesia, the President of Liberia, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom who are leading the process. Yes,
so the UN is really helping the governments to initiate the process of the discussion. So UN Secretary General has set the high-level panel, which exactly consists of the three co-chairs. And David Cameron is chairing the panel, as well as there are a number of panel members from different countries with diverse backgrounds. So there have been two meetings happening of the high-level panel, and they are planning to issue the report in May this year. After the report is issued, the UN General Assembly, which takes place in September this year, would present the view on the new Millennium Development Goals. Yeah. And then the government negotiations process would start. But what's really new about the new Millennium Development Goals, it's that it's not only renewing the Millennium Development Goals. The whole discussion is how do we develop in a more sustainable way. So the second track of the UN process is looking at sustainable development agenda, and this really comes from the Global Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio. And the conference really sets out the general statements on how the sustainable development should look like. But what was set up is the working group on Sustainable Development Goals, and it's an intergovernmental process which looks on different aspects of sustainable development and sees how we can improve in the future. A big question is how do post-MDG process and the Sustainable Development Goals process would come together, because a high-level panel on post-MDGs is working towards May deadline, whereas the open working group on Sustainable Development Goals is only starting its work.
Yeah, so they're out of sequence.
So they're a little bit out of sequence, and what's also is not clear at the moment is what do we all mean by sustainable development. Some people see it as purely environmental issues. Others see sustainable development as the new way of doing development, including social determinants, having a stronger link between welfare and economic goals of development. So this whole discussion on what sustainable development is still very open. And it's important that we all get clear what we mean by this before we move further on discussing more concrete priorities.
There were 8 Millennium Development Goals, and there's now 11 consultation areas. How is it possible to have something that concentrates on so many different areas effectively? Because they seem to have, the number of areas seems to have increased rather than somebody saying, oh, well, we'll downgrade that.
Yes, I think we should be ambitious to focus on a big amount of goals. And I think if we can be bold about development, we should be bold within the current discussions on post-MDGs, because it is a framework which can really deliver change. And I partly agree with you that 8 goals is a lot, but because the whole governance and the structure of the Millennium Development Goals has been around goals, targets and objectives, actually it has been possible quite clearly to monitor their progress. So whereas in the new framework one would want to focus on less of the issues, I think we need to be ambitious and keep it as open as possible at this stage, particularly at the consultations, and then work together to come up with the overarching goals and proxy indicators which on one hand unite different goals together, but at the same time I really believe that it's important to maintain the targets and the indicators framework so that we don't lose we don't lose in the new framework the unachieved goals of the previous framework.
Changes in the wealth of countries has transformed the world over the last 50 years. Jobs are the beginning of the end to poverty. Why not focus on the goal of economic transformation?
Yes, the economic growth has been really important in decreasing the inequality between countries. So countries like China, India has made the immense progress, and actually they have been really progressive in implementing the Millennium Development Goals because of their economic growth. However, what we know is that economic growth increases inequalities within countries. So whereas economic growth is important for development, it's not the key which would open the door for the better life of the people. So what is important is to find the correct balance between welfare development objectives and economic development objectives.
And indeed those medium income countries are the place where the most poor people are.
Yes, what we know is that the biggest amount of poorest people and also people living with HIV/AIDS are living in middle-income countries. So it's important to find the new approach because although these countries are quite well off, the population of poorest people in them is growing, and as the country develops, the inequalities continue to grow. But also when we mean economic growth, it's important to define it correctly. Would economic growth deliver for the poorest people? When we mean work with the private sector, what kind of private sector involvement is it in development? Is it really benefiting for the communities, or is it more focusing on the profits?